It's an entirely different world out there. And I think the best part of it was it's almost a meditative, or it puts you in a very different state where, you're not contactable, you're not distracted, you're fully in the moment, which I think in this day and age, it's almost impossible to do.
Off-Gassing, a Scuba podcast with host Nick Hogel. During my trip to Ceningan earlier this year, I met Alissa. She completed her advanced open water during our time there, and I wanted to know more of her story. In this episode, she speaks about her open water experience, how the peaceful and quiet atmosphere of the underwater world brings her joy, how she learns to find comfort and adapt to different situations in less than optimal environments that arise while scuba diving, and some future destinations she would like to visit. I hope you enjoy. Alissa, how are you doing this evening?
Yeah, doing well, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
No, I really appreciate you coming on. So just a little bit of a backstory for you listeners out there. I met Alissa at Ceningan Divers, was that about a month ago, maybe? Something like that? Where she was completing her advanced open water course, and me and my girlfriend Becca were doing some fun diving over there. So I met Alissa and wanted to bring her onto the podcast. So I really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, cheers, thank you.
My first question I always like to ask is, tell me why you got into scuba diving, what led you to want to get certified, and then also tell me about that first experience, that first breath underwater.
So I started diving about just over 3 months ago, which is actually pretty recent. I think it's always been something that's been, on my mind, on my bucket list to try. Just kind of never really made the time, and then post-COVID, it felt like something that was worthwhile giving a shot at, and given I'm based out of Singapore, it just felt like a much more accessible hobby compared to most other hobbies, given that some of the best diving sites are in Asia. The weather is also fairly warm. Decided to do my open water in Rawa Island, that's in Malaysia. So did the pool session in Singapore first, then went over to Rawa Island. So I think for me, I've always liked nature, I've always liked the outdoors, but you know how they tend to categorize people into two categories, one being, more like mountain people, the other being more ocean people. I would say I was always more of the former, much more comfortable on my feet, like being outside. But I've had a lot of friends who did learn to dive, and they say, it's an entirely different experience. It's an entirely different world out there, and it's worth giving it a shot. So yeah, decided to do that along with my partner. And I think for me, I was never really, naturally that comfortable in water. So in Singapore, I learned to swim as a kid at a pretty, call it 6, 7 years old. And you're fairly confident in a swimming pool, in a very controlled environment. But every time I went on holiday, what I found was swimming in the ocean without a life jacket, that's an entirely different feeling. So I did feel like I was, a bit uncomfortable in the ocean, but I kind of always wanted to see, what was this all about. So I would say the first breath underwater in the pool wasn't necessarily the most intuitive experience for me. It wasn't, boom, it was life-changing. I want to do this. I want to see, everything else that's out there. The good thing was, because it was in the pool and not necessarily, in shallow waters of the ocean, it made it easier to get more comfortable. But I think, again, it wasn't naturally kind of a flick of a switch. Oh, I love this. I definitely want to do this again. And that was that wasn't a natural process for me, even in Rawa Island itself. But because Rawa's pretty shallow and the waters are very clear, so that made it a much more kind of comfortable or rewarding experience. Good visibility. You could see a lot, you could see a decent amount already after the first couple of dives. And I think, that kind of made me want to try it again. So, yeah, I would say then the second dive trip my partner and I did, we went to Phuket and some of the South Islands in Thailand. And that was a pretty short liveaboard, about 2 nights, 3 days. I thought it was a good way to kind of get more practice in and get more comfortable. We're fairly unlucky with the weather at some point because visibility got pretty bad. And I think, then it taught me to get again, more comfortable, less anxious, even in, less than perfect environments. So I think that over time, eventually when I did come to Bali for my advanced open water, I felt a bit more comfortable then. And then you realize that, once you kind of do the dives that are not so perfect, you get a lot more adjusted to it, and then you can fully appreciate, the dives that go really well with great visibility, things like that. And yeah, like what my friends said was 100% true. You feel like it's an entirely different world out there. And I think the best part of it was it's almost a meditative, or it puts you in a very different state where, you're not contactable, you're not distracted, you're fully in the moment, which I think in this day and age, it's almost impossible to do. Yeah, even if you're climbing a mountain or you're taking a walk somewhere, by and large, you always have your phone with you. Maybe you go like, hey, I want to stop. I just got to check a message. You're still reachable. But I think, once you're underwater, it's just you and your rig, and you can't even say anything to anyone. You're relying on hand signals, maybe a slate. And that gives you, close to an hour of complete, relaxation, peace of mind of being in the moment. That I think it's something quite unique. And I think that's kind of really what shifted the needle for me as well. Once I got fairly comfortable, I think, then you really start to feel like much more relaxed and much more in the moment than you do in most other activities, I would say.
Okay. No, that's awesome. And I completely agree. That's one of the highlights and things I love so much about scuba diving is when you're in the water, it really is like just a disconnect from the everyday life, everyday pressures of the surface. So no, I completely agree, and that's such a great outlook to have on it. A question about so obviously, because I know some people will do a discover scuba dive, but you just wanted to quote unquote, no pun intended, just dive right into the open water course.
Yeah, exactly. I think for me, it felt like, by and large, if you kind of wanted to do it on a regular basis, the open water made the most sense. And, if you're fairly time constrained, it felt like one of those things that, get the open water done and then you're kind of ready to go already, or at least, be ready to do most dives subsequently. And that's kind of where I came from. And I think because majority of my friends who had done it, they've already learned diving a couple of years ago. So it's actually, I would say, more commonplace among my friends to kind of go straight in the open water. And I did ask my friend, so is it possible to fail? And she's like, well, no. By and large, if you do fail, it's more a function of your own discomfort about not being willing or comfortable to complete all the skills. But I think, at the end, it came down to finding a location that, as a beginner diver, you feel comfortable, and also finding, I think, a good instructor or a good company to partner up with. For example, things like, clearing your mask, or even, skills that that you would take some time getting used to. It makes a big difference to have an instructor that's very patient, non-judgmental, and very helps you feel a bit more comfortable. But obviously, because I learned with my husband as well, and having someone learning with you also puts you in a more comfortable state, I think, than if you were to go it alone. And then let's say you're in a group with maybe 4 other strangers, and then you feel pressured to complete the skills at a certain amount of time. And I think one thing I realized is, the more anxiety you feel about doing something, the harder it becomes. Imagine, you're not comfortable clearing your mask in the ocean, and then you fail the first time, and then 4 other people are waiting for you. I think it gets harder and harder to get it done. So I think that's when I felt like, a couple of the boxes were ticked. I was a lot more comfortable. So for us, for example, our open water course only had, 2 people, including myself, with 1 instructor. And then for my advanced open water, it happened to be 1-to-1 as well. So that was a lot more helpful in terms of, in a situation where there's a bit more currents, where the water is maybe somewhere you're less familiar with, you feel like you can trust your instructor, or at least your dive group completely. I think that's always very important too.
No, that's a great answer. And my next question is someone, I guess, it's been a while since I took my open water course, probably about like 6 or 7 years. My question to you, do you have good points and bad points? Like, is there anything that you wish could have went better, or what was the overall take from the class?
Sure. I think so what were the good points is maybe, for example, some courses, if you do it in a dive center overseas, they'll start you off, instead of the pool session, they may start you in shallower parts of the water or the ocean rather. For me, I think the good point is always starting in a pool. So even if you're going to somewhere foreign, where possible, if the dive center has a deep pool for you to, start with, that helps in terms of, you remove one of the variables of, the unknown of the ocean. So, even if you're in calm water, some people are just not completely comfortable with the waves, or, it's a strange sensation when you're breathing underwater in a very foreign space. Whereas I think if you start at a pool, at least okay, it's a pool, it's only so deep. I'm just learning how to breathe underwater. That's the only factor that's really changing in the whole process of learning to dive. So I think that's always helpful. And then in terms of, maybe not so good points, things like that, I think there weren't necessarily not so good points, as I think things that, like I said, I struggled a bit more with. And I think it really varies person to person. Like, for example, for me, the whole notion of taking out my rig underwater, finding it, that didn't stress me at all, even though, during that period of time you can't actually breathe. But again, like clearing my mask fully when I can't see, and then at some point water starts going in my nose, that's something I found very, very uncomfortable. And it seems like, having spoken to a couple of people, some other people feel that way too. And I think for me, the challenge was I can't really open my eyes in seawater. So what I found was when I couldn't see, when the water was in the mask, and if I felt a bit of water going into my nose, that's when I start to get a lot more panicky. So I think that takes a lot more kind of mental conditioning. Maybe some people are more prone to getting easily panicky or easily anxious. And I think that takes a bit of conditioning to get used to. So it's helpful to do that in the pool before then going into the ocean, because, you get through that panic and that anxiety first in a more controlled environment. I think other than that, for example, skills that, maybe if you're not a very confident swimmer, or you're not super comfortable treading water, things like, removing your equipment and then putting on your BCD, etc., when you're in open water may be less comfortable. But for me, the swimming part was never really the issue, because we learned to swim at a pretty young age, so that was fairly comfortable. I think it was just the whole being underwater part that takes a bit more getting used to. What I would say is, I think there could be more emphasis in terms of buoyancy for the open water practice. I think, you do get a bit of it, of course, but I think a lot of divers eventually, when they start doing fun dives, what you find is, buoyancy, or finding kind of the optimal buoyancy is still a bit of a struggle, which they do cover anyway in advanced open water. But I feel like, it's such an important skill that it does help to cover or practice a bit more of that, if time permits, in the open water as well.
Okay, no, that's a great perspective, and I do agree too. I think there should be a bigger emphasis on buoyancy, and I know in the slates, the instructor slates, it's, your student should have master of buoyancy, but I really feel that that's kind of a tough thing to get in a class, especially if it's an expedited class. And I'm not saying yours was, but a lot of them are. No, that's a really, really great point. So no, that's awesome. So you completed your open water. Were you able to get any fun dives on that same trip, or was it just kind of the open water and then you were done?
Yeah, so we did manage to do a couple of fun dives, and I mean the good thing was the skills itself didn't take, that long. So, every time we went into the water, once we finished our skills, maybe in the first, call it 10, 15 minutes, because it was just the two of us, it meant that, we could basically do a fun dive right there and thereafter. So that was good, and I think, that again was a big motivator for wanting to complete the course or wanting to continue, is that the water was very clear, and then you get a good experience of seeing the corals. We saw this massive jellyfish as well, so I think that motivated me to progress a bit more, and that's really where it came from. So I would say we got a couple of fun dives in, and then basically what we did subsequently when we went to southern Thailand was, we did about 9 dives across a couple of days on a liveaboard. And I think that was helpful in terms of doing more boat dives because in Rawa Island in Malaysia, that was mostly shore dives. Yeah, and then getting us comfortable rolling into the water, and then seeing slightly different environments, and as well my point about the visibility. I think when you first learn, you want to find a place that's optimal in terms of temperature, in terms of depth, in terms of visibility. As you go on more dives, for me, the lack of good weather wasn't kind of the worst case scenario for us, because at least that meant we got to try and be comfortable with less optimal environments. And I think that's pretty important, especially when you're a beginner, because, for example, at least the next time if you do your advanced night dive, you're not entirely new to low visibility environments, because you've had a day dive post monsoon rain where you can barely see anyway because there's a lot of silt, which is kind of what happened to us.
Okay. So when the visibility got pretty low, or lower, I should say, how did that deter you at all from wanting to keep diving, or was it kind of just another aspect added? Like, because I know some people in low visibility, it's kind of a game changer. It's like something that they're not going to do. So obviously you still enjoyed it. Was there any factor there?
Yeah, I wouldn't say necessarily that I enjoyed it. I guess it was more of, you kind of, I think anything about nature is, the beauty of it is it's there, but at the same time, because it's nature, you never know what you're gonna get at any point of time. And I say this because I just came back from a trip, a hiking trip in Norway, and then there was a storm, and it was a torrential downpour and crazy wind, and you just don't know what to expect, and I think you have to be okay with less than perfect conditions. For a diver who's maybe had 70 dives under their belt, and they've seen, mantas, they've seen whale sharks, of course they'll go and see, monsoon weather conditions, and they go like, why do I even want to go down? What's the point? For someone that's fairly new, it's more like, okay, everything is still so fresh and new in terms of, you can see some corals and you go, that's the most beautiful, dive I've ever been on. And I think, when you have the perspective of a beginner diver, interestingly enough, I think everything kind of surprises you. So yeah, back to your point, I think, the weather wasn't great, but I think it was worthwhile just trying to get the exposure. To be frank, it wasn't, I wasn't one of those dives I really enjoyed. I mean, A, it's cold, and then B, you can't see that much. I think it's also very much a mental thing. It's just putting yourself in the headspace when you go down and realizing you can't see that far out, that you still feel like as long as you can see your guide and your buddy and be aware of your environment, you don't really have that much to worry about. I think you just have to be extra aware and extra cautious. But a lot of it is mental in terms of, how you feel about the situation as well, right? So if you feel very panicky and you just want to, abort the dive immediately, I mean, there's no problems in doing so, especially if visibility is really bad. But I think, trying to first work through that kind of mental block you feel, or that discomfort, is helpful. I think it's helpful practice. It's like the same thing as, maybe the first time you flood your mask and then you can't breathe, you want to surface immediately. How do you actually overcome that feeling, and applying that practice to, situations where either the water's too cold, or the current's very strong, or the visibility isn't good. So I think, similar case in Bali, for example, where, the temperatures can actually get pretty chilly, but how do you kind of adapt to that and still feel comfortable while still feeling safe?
Awesome. No, I agree. So I used to be a pretty active instructor in Texas, in the United States, and we had a freshwater lake, and sometimes the visibility was just absolutely horrible. And I would always tell people, though, if you could have fun here and you can make it here, anywhere you go, you're going to have an absolutely wonderful time. Because most people, when they're going on their dive trips to these beautiful destinations. They're going where the water is clear and they can see it, very far, and there's a lot more stuff to see in the water. Whereas in Lake Travis, you could see some catfish, some other types of, random fish, but for the most part, it's not the I don't want to say it's not the greatest area, because I really do enjoy diving there. It's just a great place to train. It's a great place to kind of hone your skills and get better for when you actually do go on that next dive trip. So after Thailand, did you know leaving there that you wanted to go and complete your advanced, or did that come a little bit afterwards?
Yeah, it's a bit more on the fence. So I didn't feel like it was necessary because I have quite a few friends who, they just got their open water and then they just mainly use their open water and they've never really progressed and they've still gone on a lot of dives. For me, it was more a function of, I had a bit of time. So I figured, I'm looking to do another trip, may as well use that time to do an advanced open water as well. Because what I did notice was with a lot of liverboards, there is an expectation that you have, advanced open water qualifications. So I figured, if I'm going to do another dive anyway, I may as well do my course alongside it. And I do feel like at least that gives a bit more, opens the breadth of places I can go. I mean, at the end, I think it was helpful in terms of, naturally getting more dives under the belt, that also going in further depth. And even the waters in Bali, for example, given the nature of the currents, etc., it is a bit different from the previous locations I've gone. And I mean, eventually, we would like to do, for example, Komodo Islands or somewhere like that, where naturally you need, a better skill set and more dives under your belt, etc. So I think all of this is kind of a stepping stone to see what's out there eventually for us. Because there's still so many locations in Southeast Asia to explore as well. So I think it's just, over time we'll see where we can go and what we can eventually do there. Though I would say I would like to do a night dive at some point, because my advanced water courses didn't include one. I think it's one of those things that maybe will be a bit scary or nerve-wracking at first, but I've heard a lot of people say they really enjoyed it. And again, it's a very, very different experience from, diving in the day. So but we'll see.
I absolutely love night diving. It's one of my favorite types of diving, just because the way that I explain it to people, well, for a few different reasons. One thing is all the cool stuff comes out at night. The stuff that you don't see in the daytime will just come out at night, and there's so much life down there, and there's so much cool stuff to see. And also, when we're diving in the daytime, one of the first things that we learn is as we get deeper, we start to lose colors. And you don't realize it that much until you're looking at a video afterwards. Everything just kind of has a bluish hue or a greenish tint to it, depending on where you're diving. But when you're diving at nighttime, what's nice about it is you have your torch or your flashlight, whatever you want to call it, and everything is blacked out except for where you're shining your light, and you're actually seeing the true colors of everything. So everything just looks so much more vibrant, and it's just such a cool feeling, especially when you see some, crazy critter crawling by, swimming by or whatnot. It's definitely a really, really enjoyable time. So I highly, highly suggest that you go out there and get your, do the night diving specialty, wherever you may go. And I guarantee, you'll overcome that fear, and it'll be some of your favorite types of diving. So tell me about your overall experience and thoughts about the advanced open water course.
So I think I was told beforehand it's pretty fun, and I would say, that's accurate. Because if you look at the list of options for advanced open water, aside from, 2 compulsory options, you can pretty much choose from a list of different types of dives. And by and large, it's a lot less skills focused than the open water course. So you spend a lot less time, I would say, really testing skills, and you get to kind of see a lot more, do a lot more of the dives that you maybe would want to do. I mean, take for example, if you're doing a drift dive, effectively, to complete the drift dive course, you just need to do a drift dive. There isn't necessarily a set of, tests that you have to do as such. So I think because of that, it's right. People are right in that it's a fairly enjoyable course, and you get a bit more options in terms of focusing on things that you're interested in. So, for example, wreck diving is an option. I think photography is also an option. Fish ID, night dives, etc. So, I think it caters to a lot of people's interest. The one that's obviously pretty helpful is the peak buoyancy course, and that's the one I did as well. As we discussed earlier, I think it's one of those skills that you get a bit of a flavor for in open water, but it's nice to spend a bit more time in advanced course doing it as well. I think for me, one of the favorite ones was the drift diving course. Probably because the locations we went to were super beautiful around Bali as well and around Nusa Ceningan. And I think it's easy as long as you feel comfortable. You don't feel like you're being kind of swept away or taken away by the current more quickly than you like, because it requires so little effort, right? And then without having to use much effort, you get to see so much. And that tends to be where, the corals are extremely beautiful as well. So I think for me, once you get taught the skill set of, moving along with the current and not against it, but at the same time controlling or managing how quickly you're getting pushed forward, then you're at a state where you can appreciate the scenery a lot more. And then we got to see mantas on one of our dives as well, and that was my first time, so got super lucky there. Only thing was no molas on my fish ID. But that would have been a bit of yeah, exactly. But I knew that was a long shot anyway, so that was a problem at all. I think the challenging thing on the fish ID was, turns out, I mean, I knew this all along, but my drawing is really bad, and my drawing is even worse underwater, where it's just another thing that you have to try and do, which is naturally not that easy. And I do feel like in this day and age, really that should just turn into a GoPro, shoot and identify course more than anything else.
No, I agree.
Yeah, so I mean, I would say that, overall, probably the drift diving was the highlight. And I think, going at further depth, etc., I think, you just focus a bit more in terms of equalizing. But it doesn't actually, 30 meters versus, call it 15, doesn't really feel all too different for the most part. I think, unless you get, you start to get nitrogen narcosis at that depth, you wouldn't necessarily feel too different. And from my conversations with most people, they get it closer to, 40 or something like that. So I personally haven't experienced it myself, so it felt like a pretty normal dive to me. Maybe, you start to realize that you're right, the colors on the slate get completely mixed up and you can't see red at all. But I mean, aside from that, I wouldn't say it felt materially different from most of my other dives.
When you were doing the reading of the advanced open water course, that's kind of the nice thing about the course, is it introduces you to different types of diving. Drift diving, it could be night diving, peak performance buoyancy, search and recovery. There's a few different options. When you were doing the reading, was there any that stood out to you, like, oh, I would like to pursue this, or maybe go a little bit more in depth on this to actually maybe take like a specialty besides night diving, obviously?
Yeah, sure. I think not particularly, but the other one that looked a bit interesting as well was the wreck diving, for example, because we did go to a shallow wreck site in southern Thailand as well. So even with an open water, you could go to the wreck. It's just that you couldn't go to the bottom of the wreck because that will be beyond the depth of open water. So I did get kind of a flavor for that. And then you start to see, some of the corals and the fishes around the wreck. And to me, that was something that was pretty interesting as well. Because I guess, if you're constrained by maybe the region that you're diving in, let's say you're mainly diving in Southeast Asia, to a certain degree, maybe the kind of animals you see won't be entirely different. So it's quite nice to see a slightly different terrain. Of course, unless you're going to, somewhere, let's say in the Atlantic, and then you get very different species of animals, then it's a completely different environment. So yeah, I think, that it will be an interesting one to do, just because you get exposed to something slightly different. So I was thinking of making, a trip to kind of Amet, Talamban area as well, given that I was in Indonesia, and there are some famous wreck sites there, but didn't really have enough time to do so on my last trip in Bali. So, maybe that's one for another time as well.
So as far as right now, do you think you'll pursue any more courses in scuba diving, or are you just going to kind of hold off and just enjoy the dives for right now?
Yeah, for now I think I'll hold off and then, do more fun dives kind of in different locations, get a sense of, what I enjoy more. I think now the challenge will be making a bit more time because I had a bit of a vacation break in the last 2-3 months, so I did have a lot more time and flexibility to travel. I think from here on out it's going to be a bit more difficult. But yeah, we'll see. I think, some of the next places I'm thinking about, Ceningan Islands, definitely one of them, because of, generally I've heard it's fairly easy to dive and fairly convenient as well for us. And, Pacific Islands, Fiji is definitely on our list as, a big vacation at some point because I heard it's super beautiful. And that will probably need a bit more time, a bit further out. So we'll need, maybe do that sometime next year, ideally. What about you? Do you have anywhere in mind or anywhere to, recommend?
Oh, everywhere. No. Well, I was gonna say, you being based in Singapore, that's such a great spot because it's such a hub that you could get to so many different areas. And I mean the places that I would recommend that I've been to, definitely there's so much to be explored in Indonesia. If you get a chance to do Raja Ampat, that's an absolutely beautiful place. I have not been to Komodo, but it's definitely on the list. We were actually looking and possibly might do a Fiji trip next year. The shop that I used to work out of in Texas, they do trips all over the place, and there's a big group of people going to Fiji, and I think it would be kind of cool to do that trip and then meet up with some old friends, go diving. But yeah, there's just so many different destinations. And then oddly enough, I always joke around with people and tell people like I'm the warm water diver. I don't want cold water at all. But there's actually a lot of cold water destinations that I'd like to visit. The Pacific Northwest in the United States, the Great Lakes in the United States, and just some other cold water destinations. Do you think you'd ever try to get into any cold water diving?
Yeah, that one I need to think more about. Probably need to get a dry suit course in as well if I want to think about that because funnily enough, we were in Bali and, even with that 5 long suit, I definitely felt pretty chilly pretty quickly. I'm not good with the cold, both outdoor, both on land as well as in sea is what I realized in my travels the last 2 months. So I think, wouldn't mind, but yeah, a dry suit will probably be necessary. But I think the real challenge is, your face and your extremities are still exposed, right? So being okay with being in that cold for a while, I think would be pretty difficult. And for me, what I realized is, my consumption is generally pretty high, and I think in environments where I feel cold or I feel uncomfortable, my efficiency gets worse, which will probably mean I'm gonna be down there for like, 30-40 minutes at best, and I'm like, yeah, I have to surface already. Either because I'm too cold or I'm gonna run out of air.
No, I would, definitely look. Don't write it off completely because once you start looking into it, there's some absolutely beautiful cold water destinations, and I do, oddly enough, I have a dry suit and I brought it to Southeast Asia. I have not had to use it yet, but I'm sure depending on kind of what courses I go and do take, it might be beneficial for me to use it. But no, if it's a more than a 3 mil, I kind of start to get unhappy. I'll do a 5 mil, but when it starts to hit that 7 mil, I'm just like, this is just a lot of neoprene. You're almost uncomfortable at that point, just real stiff and everything. And then one suggestion I always recommend, especially for you and your partner being diving buddies, going on these diving trips is I always recommend people make it to at least rescue, because it'll start making you think differently as a diver. And I think there's a lot of value in that course, especially, like, I'd always tell families this: if you're going to be traveling as a family diving, it'll make you a better diver. It'll make you look at things differently, and you're better prepared. I mean, I know we're never completely prepared for when, the real stuff hits, but it's definitely a course that I would highly suggest for anybody to take. And you're pretty much right there, because it's usually open water advanced. And then you have to actually go get CPR, first aid certified to take the rescue. But I would highly suggest that. And it might be, it could be a very fun course too if you get in with a good group of people.
Got it. Nice. Thanks for the recommendation. I'll check it out.
Yeah, no worries. So as of now, there's no future dive trip plan, just some things in the books, but nothing set in stone yet for you?
Yeah, exactly. Unfortunately, that's the case. Hopefully we can get something in, or there are some even weekend trips that they do out of Singapore. So you leave Singapore on like a Friday late afternoon and come back on Sunday via liveaboard. Going to, let's say, Tioman or something. So if we have time constraints, I think that's doable on a weekend. We'll see if we decide to squeeze that in, but for now we're staying put. I think the only dive spot in Singapore is on this island called Pulau Hantu, which translates to Ghost Island, I believe.
Okay.
Where visibility is apparently terrible. It's more known for muck diving, but generally I've heard water is pretty bad and not the cleanest, or can be fairly polluted as well. So yeah, taking a pass on that for now, unless I really decide that I want to go get into the waters and dive again. So we'll see.
No, that's awesome. Well, I mean, for me, if I go diving, generally, or if I want to go diving, I should say, I have to hop on a plane. And luckily, kind of like we were saying, there's a lot of beautiful destinations very close to where I am in the Penang area. It's obviously not a big airport like Singapore, but we do have some good international destinations that we can get to. And then so we actually we'll go to a pool from time to time, just because I gotta scratch that itch. And we were actually in a pool this past weekend just to kind of get in there and just make sure the skills are still there or whatnot. So that's always an option too, just to get in a pool and practice some skills. And usually you'll find that there's more people willing to do that. So if you ever get that itch that you need scratched, you could definitely go hit up a pool. I'm sure there's plenty of them in Singapore.
Oh, got it. Yeah, makes sense. Sounds good.
Well, I want to thank you very, very much for coming on to the podcast and just kind of letting us know about your journey and your perspective on the courses that you've taken and the places that you've been. I really appreciate it. And I hope that we could get some future dives in. Maybe, once the workflow gets to a little bit more minimum, hopefully we can run into each other on another dive site.
Yeah, sounds good. Looking forward. Thanks a lot. And thanks for your time as well.
Offgassing, a Scuba podcast.